Welcome to the Group 5, Period 3, Parts Unknown. The history of the world is debated whether major historical actions were all coincidence or if things happened for a certain reason. Is the world all the result of a butterfly effect, or were there causes for genocides and revolutions in the stars? I'm your host, Adam Moore. Today our news team is looking at the Harlem Renaissance and why specifically did the Renaissance take place in Harlem. There were countless other all-black cities in the United States, so why did the Renaissance take place in Harlem, New York? Why didn't the Renaissance take place in Philadelphia or Detroit? Let's start with our senior history correspondent, Jacqueline Duran. Take us away, Jackie.
Thanks, Adam. Before we take the Lenox Avenue IRT subway down to Harlem, let's learn about the place we're leaving from. Up until the early 1900s was a rural farm town, known for its dairy and cheese. In 1904, one of the most exciting things to ever happen in Harlem was the construction of the 1904 Lenox IRT subway train. It was a relatively small train. In 1895, after a recession, construction started on beautiful apartment buildings. New York was quite clever with pushing the population towards Harlem. In the early 1900s, Harlem was home to many races and ethnic groups such as the Irish, Dutch, German, Haitian, and Jewish. Harlem was the spot for Jews and the Italian mafia. There were 200,000 Jews and 150,000 Italians in Eastern Harlem by 1915. Yeah, The Godfather or Fiddler on the Roof could have easily have taken place in Harlem. The Jews brought City College of New York to Harlem, which encouraged the arts greatly, kind of, part of the Harlem Renaissance, wink wink. The neighborhood became a popular center for conventional arts such as moving pictures, vaudevilles, which is a combination of unrelated skills, skits and comedy, dancing, singing, etc., and musical theater. As the prices of housing went up, the Jews left, with Puerto Ricans taking their place. African Americans had been living in Harlem since the 1800s, but they weren't the majority population. They, alongside all the whites, were farmers and made cheese. When the Harlem Renaissance erupted, African Americans were encouraged to celebrate their pride. With all the art exploding in the neighborhood, people who were ready to embrace their heritage was ready to shout it from the rooftops. And with this painting, you can really see the sense of community and warmth that was welcomed into Harlem. When the Harlem Renaissance erupted, African Americans were encouraged to celebrate their pride. With all the art exploding in the neighborhood, people who were ready to embrace their heritage, ready to shout it from the rooftops, this was their time to do so, and they did. Realtor Philip Payton Jr., with his company to the African American Realty Company, understood that with the big housing crisis at the time that brought in the Jews could also bring in the African Americans. Black churches such as the St. Philip's Abstinent Baptist Church and Mark's Methodist Church moved uptown in 1907. So, to conclude, Adam, by 1914, roughly 50,000 African Americans of the 60,000 who lived in Manhattan were living in Harlem. And with the history of Harlem, we can see why.
Now I'll take you to our senior Great Migration correspondent, Giselle Aguero, to tell you about how African Americans came to Harlem.
Thanks, Adam. The Great Migration began in 1916, and at first it had become a trend where people would travel to different cities all throughout the country, experimenting how their culture would fit into the society of where they were in that point in time. The Great Migration began in 1916. At first it had become a trend where people would travel to different cities all throughout the country, experimenting how their culture would fit into the society of where they were in that point in time. Driven from their homes, most African American families packed up and left because of unsatisfactory economic opportunities and harsh segregationist laws, so essentially many decided to head north. By the year 1919, some 1 million blacks had left the South, but there was a competition between jobs and eventually housing, which led to people segregating against the blacks even more than they already were. But most importantly, they had to worry about the KKK. And 200 years later, what are we still worrying about? The black population of major northern cities had increased by large percentages: New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit. Eventually, African Americans had to find a way to handle and deal with the obstacles, and many families started to make lives of their own in the most prominent urban cities. But the most prominent one was Harlem. What was formerly an all-white neighborhood was filled with 200,000 African American families. What a story. However, when all the African Americans had finally found their sanctuary, meaning Harlem, they had come to realize that the North and the South were in many ways dealing with segregation.
Thank you, Giselle. There were also a great prize of equality and freedom of expression to be had in Harlem. They made the city what they wanted and needed. Harlem was oozing with rich African American culture. It was so popular that in 1910, the population was 775,500 people, and in 1920, it grew to 868,500 people. That's almost 100,000 more people in just 10 years. This growth was shown because Harlem was a very accepted place of all races. Many immigrants went to Harlem for work, seeking jobs such as steel production, highway building, and working at gas stations. On the other hand, many educated people flocked to Harlem to work as doctors, lawyers, and bankers. By night, Harlem was booming with people. Popular places like the Cotton Club was a very attractive place for young people of all races. White people would especially love these clubs. They would come to Harlem and fuel the overall economy, which would drive even more people to Harlem. New music such as jazz, swing, and blues grew massive popularity during the Harlem Renaissance. One of the biggest things that came out of the Harlem Renaissance was the sense of racial pride. After events such as slavery, racism was still a huge part of people's mindset. Minorities, mostly African Americans, wanted everybody to be equal to each other. Their beliefs support the idea of equality in a community. As seen by the painting here by Palmer Hayden, called Midnight Summer Night in Harlem, this painting shows the sense of community in Harlem and how they interacted with each other as a whole. In conclusion, Harlem not only brought African Americans together, but also skyrocketed their culture into modern times.
In the 1920s, the gravitational pull towards Harlem was the dream of creative freedom built by the Italians and Jews and promised sanctuary after the migration.
Thanks for tuning in to Group 5, Period 3, Parts Unknown.